Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sarah Spinks.
Welcome back to Safeguarding Conversations. Today we're focusing on an important and increasingly discussed topic: masking, distress and hidden vulnerability. In safeguarding, we often think about visible indicators of concern, such as changes in behaviour, attendance difficulties or emotional distress. But some children and young people may work very hard to conceal how they're feeling, which can make vulnerability less visible to the adults supporting them.
Yeah, that's right. So masking refers to the way in which some children and young people attempt to hide their difficulties or distress in order to appear as though everything is fine. And this may involve trying to fit in socially, suppressing anxiety or copying peer behaviour or working very hard to meet expectations, even when doing so feels really overwhelming. So masking is often discussed in relation to children with SEND, particularly autistic pupils, but it's important to recognise that many children may mask distress for a whole variety of reasons.
Absolutely. So masking's not always immediately obvious, is it, to professionals working with children?
No, not at all. And it can make identification sort of more complex. So a child may appear to be coping well in the school environment, but may be experiencing significant emotional strain internally. For example, a pupil may follow routines carefully, avoid drawing attention to themselves, or try really hard to meet expectations, even when they're feeling anxious or overwhelmed. And sometimes distress may only become visible once the child reaches a point where maintaining that effort becomes too difficult.
So that suggests that vulnerability is not always reflected in outward behaviour. Some children who appear quiet, compliant or highly engaged may still be experiencing significant stress. Masking may sometimes mean that difficulties are not identified until they have intensified, which may lead to sudden changes in attendance, emotional well-being, or engagement in learning. So from a safeguarding perspective, this reminds us that visible behaviour does not always tell the whole story.
Exactly. And that's why understanding hidden vulnerabilities is really important. So children may not always communicate distress directly. Instead, adults may notice patterns such as increasing fatigue, withdrawal, heightened anxiety around transitions, or difficulties in less structured environments. And some children may also find social interaction particularly demanding, which can contribute then to that emotional exhaustion.
So in practice, staff may notice small changes before more obvious concerns emerge. For example, if a pupil who becomes increasingly reluctant to participate, appears more tired than usual, or becomes overwhelmed by changes to routine. These changes in themselves, they may not immediately indicate safeguarding concerns, but they may suggest that a child is experiencing increased pressure or distress. It's interesting that masking can sometimes be associated with positive behaviours, such as trying hard to meet expectations.
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt, my daughter was a classic master. She was a classic autistic spectrum, high achiever, masked the whole way through school, used to come home utterly exhausted and needed to have time out. And I think it can make identification more difficult. She was a very compliant, very good girl. But a child may be working extremely hard to manage their environment, which may not always be recognised by adults.
Yeah.
So over time, this effort, it really can contribute to emotional fatigue, a sort of reduced resilience or increased anxiety.
I mean, Even just listening to you speak, Sarah, it sounds exhausting.
Yeah,
Absolutely
exhausting.
exhausting.
Yeah,
So the challenge for professionals is recognizing when a child may need additional support, even when concerns are not immediately obvious.
exactly. So safeguarding practice involves noticing patterns over time and considering context. And interestingly, I'm thinking back to a time I had a child in my last school before I retired, whose mum was saying, she was a really, really good little girl in school. She was gorgeous, she was quiet, she worked hard, she was lovely. She'd go home and have massive meltdowns at home. And mum was coming to me and saying, "This is what's happening." And then when we started to look at it deeper, it's exactly what she was doing. She was masking in school, then it had to come out somewhere and it would then
Yeah.
be out at home. So we managed to be able to put things in place. So she had time out at school, and those timeouts allowed her to then release that tension and that distress and anxiety so that things began to improve a bit at home because it wasn't all sort of mounting up. So I think, again, there are two wonderful words that we love, Sam: professional curiosity.
Yeah.
It plays an important role here. Asking those gentle, supportive questions and maintaining open communication, that really can help those children feel able to express how they are feeling and how they're experiencing school and other environments. It certainly did for the little girl at school.
It's interesting, actually. I can say I have had very similar experiences to the one you've described. And I've also supported schools who have asked for additional help. And it's quite interesting when the story, if you like, is told in that everything seems to be fine at school. It's only when he or she goes home.
Sure. Yeah.
And that then directs kind of almost like the focus to, well, what's happening at
And
home,
at home,
which is
precisely.
absolutely not, it's really not,
But then our professional curiosity means we
no,
do have to ask those questions and we have to
absolutely.
feel like that. Absolutely.
Absolutely. But we can't do it without having consideration for what is it at school that makes things right. And that was always my question. It wasn't so, okay, because obviously you were going to look at the home context. That was an absolute given. But I always had my sort of next question was, well, what is it at school do you think that makes things work?
Yeah.
And once you start unpicking that, then you can start to pick up on those little cues that,
Yeah.
well, maybe things aren't quite as right at school as you think they are.
Yeah.
It's just the child is behaving or doing things, putting things in place. And it's almost like it's very similar and common, I found, in children who are maybe coping following adverse sort of childhood experiences.
Very much so.
That masking kind of, it's almost like they want one area of their life which is not linked to anything else that's happened in the past or that everybody
Yeah.
else knows, and where they can in effect just be a child again,
Sure.
if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Totally.
I think I mean, it does link closely to creating environments where children feel safe to share those concerns,
Mm.
and supportive environments, that encourage children to communicate openly. And those trusted relationships with adults, they really can help children feel reassured that their experiences will be listened to and taken seriously. Do you think there are, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, Sarah, are there any particular times when hidden vulnerability may become more visible in your experience?
Well, definitely transitions. They
Yeah,
can that can sometimes increase that pressure, that any changes in routines,
yeah,
expectations, or social environments, that require the additional adjustment, really.
mhm.
Unstructured times, such as break times or transitions between lessons, may also present challenges for some pupils as well. So it's those times that they can't rely on a structure can tip that vulnerability to become more visible.
So consistency and that predictability can really support the emotional well-being.
Definitely. Clear routines and supportive relationships can really help reduce anxiety. And just reflecting on the little girl I was talking to, the fact that her mum and I formed a really good professional relationship where mum knew she could come in at any time to talk about her worries, really settled mum, and then it gave us that platform to really look at that clarity of routine and support for the little girl. It allowed me to really understand what was going on. It allowed mum to know what was happening in school, and together, having that trusting professional relationship really settled things and allowed us to put our heads together. So I think where children feel understood, they then, I think, feel less need to mask their difficulties. And that's what happened with this little girl. She knew that I knew, and that gave her the confidence, and the fact that I understood enabled her to know that she could have time out when she needed it. And that was absolutely fine because it met her needs.
So from a safeguarding perspective, understanding, that hidden vulnerability, understanding that helps ensure that support's not only responsive, but is also preventative.
Exactly. So that early recognition that does allow staff to consider whether adjustments or additional support may help reduce stress and therefore promote well-being.
I think it also reminds us that safeguarding's not always about responding to visible crisis, but about recognising those early indicators of need. And, I know we've spoken about this a lot, noticing the small changes and considering how children are experiencing their environment. That really helps ensure that vulnerability doesn't remain hidden. So, thanks for listening to this episode of Safeguarding Conversations. If you'd like to explore more safeguarding resources and training, you can visit the SSS Learning website online, and we'll hopefully be with you again for another episode of Safeguarding Conversations. Thanks for listening.